So I've already talked about how the Switch OLED compares to the sort of regular baseline Switch, because I think that's the comparison a lot of people are looking for. After all, it is more or less a direct upgrade in a lot of different ways while offering the same kind of features. But honestly, for me, what I think is a much more compelling comparison is the Switch OLED versus the Switch Lite. Now, the reason for this is because when you look at the OLED versus the regular Switch, again, it's a lot of the same kind of stuff, and in one key area where there's not really a whole lot of differences is docked gameplay. Meanwhile, when you look at the Switch Lite versus the Switch OLED, it's much more a focus on the concept of which one really gives you the best on-the-go handheld experience, because they both offer very different strengths in this regard compared to the regular Switch model. And this is especially interesting to me because I really am a predominantly handheld player. I'll use my Switch in dock mode from time to time, especially for those games that make a lot more sense, like say Smash Brothers, but really the vast majority of the time I am playing on the go in handheld. And in fact, the Switch Lite has been my primary way of playing Switch games the last 2 years since it was released. And so with that in mind, I wanted to take kind of an extra specialized look at what both of these systems have to offer, and if your real goal is just have a new focused handheld, where each one excels. If you guys didn't see my other comparison video or haven't seen any of the other videos I've been doing, I do actually have a playlist of all the coverage I've been giving the Switch OLED, so make sure to check that out after this video. And as always, if you've been enjoying this content, please make sure to like the videos and subscribe as well if you haven't yet. I do have more stuff on the way. First off, I think something that has to be addressed right away: price. There is a very noticeable price difference between these two systems. In the case of the regular Switch versus the OLED, it's $50, which yes, $50 is $50, but when you're talking about stuff that's already in the $300 price range, it's a little more understandable. In the case of Switch Lite versus OLED though, we're talking $200 versus $350, almost half the price to grab a Switch Lite instead. This has been one of the biggest strengths of the Switch Lite compared to the regular Switch, is that, you know, being a full $100 cheaper, $150 cheaper than an OLED, just makes it a much more accessible system, not only making it appealing for something like, say, getting a system for a kid, but also if you know you're really only going to play in handheld, saving that money is really nice. With the additional enhancements the OLED has brought, however, including its better build, better speakers, and of course, an OLED display, the debate I think becomes a lot more interesting. With that all in mind though, I think there's still some things about the Switch Lite that does end up making it stand out a little bit still against the competition. Most notably, the body design. As far as just pure aesthetics go, the Switch Lite is actually still my favorite looking out of all the systems. It does still have the more noticeable bezel going on compared to the Switch OLED, but in terms of having a single unified body, the color options that it comes available in, and just the white aesthetic of the buttons and everything, I just think it looks like a much better system, and it feels a lot more to me like what I expect to find with a traditional handheld. Not only this, but being a unibody design honestly just kind of feels better when you're using it on the go. This is something that I talked about a little bit with my Switch OLED versus regular Switch comparison, in that one of the things about the regular Switch that's actually kind of annoying, and you don't notice it until you use something better, like with the Switch Lite, the rail designs on the regular Switch just allow for a little bit of jiggle on the Joy-Cons that is kind of annoying, honestly, once you get used to an option that doesn't have that. Now, like I mentioned in my Switch OLED versus regular Switch comparison, the Switch OLED does seem to have just a little more tension. Something about the rail design does keep them a little locked in, but that looseness on the Joy-Cons is still present. Better, but still there. Whereas, you know, something that's all one body, gone entirely. There's also the fact that the Switch Lite is still the only official option from Nintendo that offers a traditional D-pad instead of using the 4-button design that is present on regular Switch options. There are third-party options out there you can get that offer a D-pad, for instance grabbing Hori's D-pad Joy-Con, the SplitPad Pro has a D-pad, there are different D-pad cases that just kind of lightly modify the regular Joy-Con. There's ways to get it, but none of them are just having an innate D-pad that is really nice to have on the Lite. And then of course there's one of the obvious benefits of the Lite, it's smaller. Being a portable system, small size can be something that is very appreciated, and while the Switch Lite is not necessarily minuscule compared to a regular Switch, I would say that it is small enough in an appreciable way that does make it something that can more easily fit in bags, even in certain pockets, and really even if you bought a dedicated carrying case for a Switch Lite, it just occupies a lot less space, especially if you get the official clamshell one, which is a little pricey, but does make it very portable. Also, it is something that I think is a little minor, but worth pointing out, the Switch Lite's buttons are also different than official Joy-Cons. The official Joy-Cons that come with the Switch and Switch OLED have that very kind of light clickiness, not exactly a mechanical button, but gives you that clicky feedback, whereas the Switch Lite uses a more traditional kind of soft press. Now, by comparison, the Switch OLED gives you a lot compared to the Switch Lite. Some of this is obvious. You can dock it, of course, just like with a regular Switch, but when we're talking about just being used as a dedicated handheld, there's a lot going on here. Yes, it is larger, and yes, it is more expensive, but with a lot of upgrades that honestly, I really like to have. First off, of course, the display. Like I already mentioned in the past comparison video, the OLED display really does make a difference with making colors really pop out, the blacks get a lot deeper, and it just in general results in a better looking screen. One thing I didn't mention in my past comparison video though that I did want to touch on really quick, as part of the OLED display, the Switch OLED now has an option to turn on which is called Vivid Mode, which is on by default, and basically the idea is that it just pushes a lot of the colors on the system a lot more. And this is part of the reason why when you look at comparisons of the Switch OLED versus a Switch Lite or regular Switch, the colors just really stand out. And for the most part, I really like this mode. The fact that it is on by default, I think is the right move. However, I have noticed in a handful of games that it just pushes things maybe just a bit too much. Some games that are just already extremely colorful and vibrant on their own, especially when they focus on bright colors, can end up looking almost too oversaturated with Vivid Mode on. Now you can turn the setting off when that situation occurs, which I'm very thankful for. I just think that's important to point out because I think sometimes you're going to see some gameplay of games on the OLED that are in Vivid Mode that are just oversaturated and actually feel like a bit much, and that doesn't have to be the case. That is something you can switch off. I do think though that the majority of games, in my experience, have benefited from this mode being on. Now, aside from being OLED, another big change from the display on the Switch OLED is that the display is also larger. The regular Switch already had a bigger screen than the Switch Lite, but it was kind of a smaller amount that I don't think really mattered. But with the Switch OLED, the screen size comparison does end up being a bit more noticeable. Now, you could argue that with the Switch Lite, the smaller screen actually does result in a sharper image because they are both showing at the same resolution, which is true, but honestly, I do think the larger screen size is just flat out preferable. Yes, there's a little bit more sharpness on the Lite, but with the kind of differences we're talking about at this range, I think just the larger, greater clarity of a bigger screen is something that I can appreciate a lot more. And again, one thing that I think is worth being wary of, with OLED, there is of course that fear of burn-in. Like I mentioned in the last video, I think that some of those fears are maybe a little over the top, but it is absolutely a thing that can occur with OLED displays. And if you're the kind of person who really focuses on one specific game, like if you just do nothing but play Animal Crossing, or you do nothing but play certain retro games that have borders, when those games have things that are consistently on the screen very often, and you're just playing that one title 10 hours a day, back to back to back, yeah, that is something to be a little more concerned about. If, however, you're the kind of person that's constantly jumping between different games and you're always trying and looking out for new experiences, I really don't think it's something you need to be as worried about. Especially keeping in mind things like, again, loading screens, menus, cutscenes, just turning the Switch off on occasion if you're taking breaks. There's lots of things that help reduce the chance of burn-in occurring. Being more akin to a regular Switch, as well as having its redesigned kickstand, also means that the Switch OLED gives you a more kind of ready way to do tabletop mode. The Switch Lite technically does support tabletop mode if you want, it's just it doesn't have a built-in kickstand, so you have to buy a stand for it, you have to bring around extra wireless controllers, and the small screen on it is going to make some multiplayer games much more difficult and harder to play. Whereas the OLED, built-in kickstand, you're gonna have two Joy-Cons on the go that you can remove from it and bring additional ones along as well, and the larger screen is gonna make those on-the-go multiplayer situations more convenient. Again, like I said in my other comparison video, tabletop mode is definitely the least used of the three, but if if that is something you see yourself using and you think it's a cool option to have on occasion, the OLED is absolutely going to handle that situation better without additional accessories than the Lite would. And lastly, one very large benefit that it shares with the regular Switch versus the Switch Lite: battery life. This was really the one aspect where I did feel like the Switch Lite lost out to a regular Switch as a dedicated handheld. The Switch Lite just has a worse battery life than its full-size models, not counting the launch edition. And with the OLED offering all the additional benefits that it does for handheld gameplay and offering that larger battery life on top of it is a very appealing thing. As someone who is a big fan of dedicated handhelds, this is actually a tougher choice for me than it was for the regular Switch versus the Switch OLED, because again, there are a lot of things about the Lite that just makes it, I think, a bit more convenient as something that you're using on the go. That being said, though, the list of upgrades the Switch OLED offers to gameplay in general is just really hard to ignore. Yes, the Switch Lite is more portable and the unibody design is nice to have. I like the look of it, but at the end of the day, the OLED is giving me more battery life, a better display, a larger display, better speakers, and while it's not unibody, the better build materials that the Switch OLED has been made out of, which I still don't understand why Nintendo hasn't made a big deal out of this. The OLED just feels like a better built machine than the past other Switch models. And so it might still have that little bit of looseness that comes from Joy-Cons being railed onto the system. The rest of the body just feels really nice in comparison and just feels like a more premium device. Again, though, this is also where that concept of price comes up, right? Switch Lite, $200, Switch OLED, $350. And I think the conclusion that I've really come to is, especially if you're trying to get something for a younger gamer and you don't care about docked gameplay at all, the Switch Lite is still a preferable option for the situation. And if you don't care about docked gameplay at all and you just want the most affordable way to get into playing Switch games in any form, the Switch Lite is still going to meet that need of being cheaper while still offering access to the full library, albeit some games won't work quite as well since you can't dock them. The other thing that's interesting about this comparison to me is that, like I mentioned in my other video, upgrading from a red box Switch to a Switch OLED feels like a very difficult choice to make. The things you're gaining by spending $350 to get a whole new system all over again just doesn't feel that worth it. But on the other hand, if you bought a Switch Lite when they came out, either because it was a cheaper option or because you felt like you were only interested in portable gameplay alone at the time, going from that to a Switch OLED is a little more compelling. If you're a Switch Lite owner who at any point has ever kind of been like, oh, you know what, maybe I do want to do docked gameplay, just to have it as an option on occasion, well, now with all the other benefits the Switch OLED is offering, including the benefits to handheld gameplay like that OLED display, I think there's a little more reason to consider it. And so if you were before kind of considering, hey, I have a Switch Lite and I kind of regret not getting a regular Switch, maybe I should end up buying a regular one for $300, well, now that there's this OLED option that's $50 more and offers a whole lot more as part of the total package, I think that is something worth considering much more heavily. You know, one of my big final thoughts for my regular comparison video is that if I wasn't doing what I do for work and I had a red box Switch and saw the Switch OLED, and knowing everything that I do know from comparing the two, I would probably have held off because I'm usually pretty stingy with upgrades. But knowing what I know right now and I owned a Switch Lite and started looking at the OLED, I would actually be pretty tempted to upgrade. The Switch OLED has become my new primary Switch, at least for right now. The Switch Lite, again, does have certain things that very much tempt me. I like a lot of things about the smaller size of it, and to be honest, if there was some kind of Switch Lite OLED model, that would be the thing that I would really fall for. If I got the smaller body, but with a bigger screen that took up the rest of the body as opposed to having the bezel, offered that OLED display, offered me a D-pad, that to me is actually sort of like the dream Switch system that I would like to use. But in this situation right now, where we just have a regular style Switch with OLED and the Switch Lite for the portability and affordability, the OLED ends up winning out for me.